Welcome to another episode of Cátedra Jurídica, where we engage with leading thinkers and scholars whose work has a significant impact on law and society. I'm your host, André Uliano, and today we are very honored to have Professor Brad Wilcox with us. This program, presented by Gazeta do Povo, seeks to delve into the minds of prominent authors, exploring their latest contributions to the fields of law, sociology, and beyond. Our guest today, Professor Wilcox, is a distinguished academic currently serving as a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He is also a Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a no-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His research has profoundly shaped our understanding of marriage, fatherhood, and the crucial role that strong, stable families play in society. Professor Wilcox's latest book, Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, published by HarperCollins in 2024, challenged the prevailing narratives around marriage and family in contemporary society. Today, we will be discussing this thought provoking work and its implications for law, policy, and the fabric of our society. In addition to his extensive academic contributions, Professor Wilcox has authored and co authored 6 books and published numerous articles in both scientific journals and popular media outlets, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review. His academic journey began as a Jefferson Scholar, a very competitive position at the University of Virginia, followed by a PhD from Princeton University. He has also had prestigious research fellowships at Princeton, Yale, and the Brookings Institution. So, Professor Wilcox, it's a pleasure to have you on our program, Cátedra Jurídica. Thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Andres.
Perfect. So, Professor, to kick off our conversation, I would say to you, many in Brazil are just beginning to explore your work. So, could you share a bit about your academic journey, especially what drew you to study family dynamics and what inspired you to read your latest book, Get Married? Additionally, could you touch on the role of the Institute for Family Institutes in your research?
Certainly. So I was raised actually in a single parent household. And as a child, kind of had a keen sense that I was missing something without, my own father in the home. And when I went to college, kind of came to the conclusion that marriage was that important institution that connected, on average, men to their children, to their families. And that kind of insight then led me to pursue a PhD in sociology at Princeton University, where I studied family and culture and religion, and then came back to the University of Virginia and have been teaching sociology really here at UVA since 2002, looking at the impact of marriage on the welfare of kids, and then more recently, kind of the impact of marriage on the welfare of adults and communities and countries. I've also been involved with the Institute for Family Studies, which does a number of different reports and other research endeavors focusing on the impact of strong families on children, adults, and communities as well. And the Institute for Family Studies has been going since about 2013.
Great. When I discovered your book, I see myself very sympathetic to your approach. I tried some years ago to write an article in this newspaper, Gazeta do Povo, on the Father's Day here in Brazil. And I tried to find some data about this relationship of the presence of fathers and the well-being of kids. And I found very interesting data. And when I saw your book, that it's more, the scope's more wide, I found it extremely interesting. So, in your book, you seem to align with, if I understood it correctly, please correct me if I if I was wrong, but you seem to try to fight in the field of the enemy. Let's say like this. So you do not try to disagree with some perspectives like that professional goals to make money, this kind of aim is important. You just try to say, okay, let's accept this and let's see therefore how marriage impacts this kind of goals, um, like financial success, career advancement, personal happiness. Is this a fair interpretation of your approach? And you also present compelling data showing that married individuals tend to fare better in terms of income, assets, and overall life satisfaction. Could you elaborate a bit on these findings and share why you believe marriage has such a positive impact?
Yeah, certainly. So one thing that we're seeing today more and more in our culture, both in the mainstream media and social media, is kind of this idea that I call like the Midas mindset. And the thought here is that what matters in life is your education, your bank account, and especially your career, your work. And by contrast, kind of marriage and family are seen as less important. There was a story in the New York Times that said that married motherhood in America is a game no one wins, kind of, basically discounting the importance of marriage and motherhood for women. Targeting kind of, women. This is a very kind of common, argument from the left. Bloomberg had a piece that said that women who stay single are getting richer in America today. So kind of saying that financial security is more likely to be found for women outside of marriage. And then now on the online right, we've got Andrew Tate, who says that marriage has, quote, zero statistical advantage for men, and argues that men should steer clear of marriage and focus on basically getting rich and getting strong and kind of having a good time with women, but not investing in them and not investing certainly in marriage and family. So the point I'm getting at here is that from both kind of the left in many mainstream outlets and now from the right, with some red pill outlets like Andrew Tate, we're getting this idea that young adults should steer clear of the encumbrances of marriage and family life and instead focus on their education and their career and on making lots of money, basically. What these perspectives, this Midas mindset, I think overlooks is that for the average person, for the average man, the average woman, there's just no question that married folks are more likely to be thriving financially, and they're also more likely to be happy with their lives. And so what I see when it comes to, for instance, assets, as adults are in their 50s, getting closer to retirement, both men and women who are stably married have about 10 times the assets as their peers who are not married. And then when it comes to happiness, married women, married men are about twice as likely to be very happy with their lives compared to their unmarried peers. And what's also striking in the data today is that married fathers and married mothers are the happiest group of adults aged 18 to 55 in the United States. So there's just kind of really no truth to this idea that, just again, to quote this New York Times writer recently, she said again that married motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. And she was overlooking the fact that on average, women today in the US are happier when they have a spouse and kids in the home. And I think what a lot of contemporary voices, critics, elites don't kind of understand, don't appreciate, is that marriage, even in 2024, and family life more generally, is an opportunity to enjoy meaning, direction, purpose, a sense of solidarity, and all these things, as tough as it can be to be a spouse and a parent, tend to afford greater happiness also to men and women today than living on your own and living without the benefit of a family.
Perfect. This question of the capacity to gather assets really surprised me because it's so counterintuitive. It seems to me you tend to think, oh, if I have a family to support and kids to feed, I will have less money in the future. Is there any explanation why fathers and mothers married can gather more assets during their lives?
So it's important to kind of distinguish between marriage and parenthood here. And so there's just no question that married women and married men do better financially over the course of their lives. It's also true, though, that kids are expensive. And so if you were to compare, married childless adults across the course of their life and married parents across the course of their life, the married childless adults would be in a better spot financially, as they're hitting their 50s, for instance. But they are going to do better. The married parents are typically going to do better than the single and childless adults. So it's kind of like the idea that there's sort of a package deal in some ways, I would say, and that marriage tends to engender a sense of prudence for adults. They can pool their resources if they're both working or if they're kind of working at different parts of their life course. They're also more likely to be able to save on, obviously things like appliances, TVs, and dishwashers and the like. Not to mention their home or their apartment as well, or condominium. So that's an important point to make. But I think the other thing that people don't recognize and realize is that we're seeing a lot of men today, Andreas, a lot of men today floundering in today's society. They're just not doing well. They have no purpose, no direction. They're aimless. And I think if you go to the gym, or if you run marathons, or if you do anything physical, basically, you understand and appreciate that there's a way in which having some kind of obstacle, some kind of weight, some kind of difficulty, physically, tends to make folks stronger. And I think for men especially, having a certain degree of responsibility for a spouse and for children makes them stronger in their life more generally. And when it comes to work in particular, we have good evidence from Sasha Kilwald at Harvard University in sociology that the men who have the biggest income premium today are married men with their own children in the household. Again, married men with kids in the household earn the most money on average, controlling for things like education and race and other factors, right? And I think the point there simply is that having a responsibility for guys, for the support of your wife and your children, and I'm not saying your women can't work. I'm just saying that men benefit from having a responsibility or a set of responsibilities in terms of both a spouse and kids on average that gives their life direction, meaning, and purpose. And so that's why we see in part that guys who are married with kids tend to work harder, more strategically, and then end up earning more money. So that's the thing some people don't take into account, is that in some important respects, in this case for men, having a burden, having a responsibility, having a weight to bear, if you will, is good for us.
Great. Okay, Professor, you mentioned in your book that in discussions of inequality, today there is a strong narrative focusing only on things like race, gender, and class. However, your research emphasizes that family stability, particularly the strength of marriage, is a crucial yet overlooked factor in shaping outcomes. Including, you mentioned some groups, special groups, that are achieving better outcomes. Uh, could you discuss how family stability intersects with these questions of inequality and groups, and why this question of the strength of marriage deserves more attention in public discourse?
Certainly. So I'm literally kind of sitting here at the University of Virginia, that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, who is justly famous for being the primary author of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And in that document, talked about the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And here in the United States, and I think probably it's true elsewhere as well, in Brazil, for instance, what we're seeing is that when it comes to life, for instance, thousands of Americans every year are dying in what are called deaths of despair, deaths related to suicide, drug overdose, alcohol poisoning. We're also seeing when it comes to the American dream that many Americans have the sense that they can't rise. They can't kind of realize that classic American dream of going from rags, poverty in childhood, to riches as an adult. And then we're also seeing that more and more Americans are failing at that classic pursuit Jefferson talked about, the pursuit of happiness. Okay. And when you look at the research empirically, what you see today in the United States is that, for instance, when it comes to deaths of despair, we've got work from a Brookings scholar, Jonathan Rothwell, telling us that regionally, the number one factor he has seen accounting for more and more Americans dying from things like suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol poisoning is the fact that fewer Americans are married. Okay, so that's, in his model is the number one predictor. We have Raj Chetty at Harvard University in economics and his colleagues finding that the number one predictor of mobility for poor kids, rising from poverty as a child to riches as an adult in communities across the United States, is family structure. So poor kids who are being raised in communities where there are more two-parent families are markedly more likely to realize the American dream, to rise economically when they have healthy families around them, okay? And then finally, when it comes to this pursuit of happiness, we've got new research from a Chicago economist telling us that the number one factor that accounts for declining happiness in America, again, is the fact that fewer Americans are married. So I'm not saying that marriage is the number one factor or family is the number one factor on every outcome. That would be silly, obviously, to make that claim. I'm just saying, to you that we're getting more and more evidence that on some key outcomes related to deaths of despair, to the health of the American dream, and to happiness, that we see that marriage and family are often the most important factor or one of the most important factors in our contemporary research. And I don't think this is limited to the United States. And so when the family is strong, people are more likely to be thriving, both, again, economically and psychologically, is kind of the bottom line here. And that reality is often overlooked in our public conversations and academic research that looks at things like poverty and emotional well-being and mortality.
Perfect. In your book, you discuss some myth about marriage. The first one is the flying solo myth as a significant cultural narrative that promotes individualism over traditional family structures. Uh, could you speak a bit about how has this myth perpetuated by cultural elites influenced the decline in marriage rates and the erosion of family stability?
Certainly. So what we see basically is that a lot of journalists and social media influencers are, discounting marriage, and they're kind of giving us this idea that the way forward is to kind of fly solo. And there's a prominent NYU sociologist who has a book on going solo, and it paints a pretty positive portrait of the fact that there are more and more adults in the contemporary world who are single, who are living on their own, that they have more freedom in his telling, more autonomy, more options, more choices. And he thinks they're able to kind of, make up for the fact that they don't have a spouse and often don't have children, because they can turn to their friends, often in urban contexts across the West. And I think, certainly we all know single people who are flourishing, and we all know married people who are floundering, So I'm not saying that marriage is some kind of magical potion that makes you happy. But, the truth is that the social science could not be clearer. And that is that on average, people are less lonely, and they report more meaning in their lives, and they're happier when they're married. and they're more, on average, lonely. They report less meaning in their lives, and they're less happy and more vulnerable to deaths of despair, when they are single. And so, rather than having kind of this, fantastical conversation in some academic venues and media outlets and on social media about marriage in a needlessly critical, fashion, we need to tell people the truth. And that is that we are social animals, to quote Aristotle. And as such, our family relationships and marriages often end up being the most important things for us.
Great. Let's go to the second myth, the family diversity myth. Uh, basically, it states that this idea that money and love matter more than the family structure. What your data show about this?
Yes, this myth that I talk about, where a lot of academics and journalists kind of want us to think that every family form is equally valuable. This is the family diversity myth. And the thought here is that what matters for kids is not the structure of their families, not whether their mom and dad are married, but whether or not they get the love, kind of, vaguely defined, and the money, they need to kind of thrive. This is kind of the idea here with this family diversity myth. And we see this articulated by scholars like Philip Cohen at the University of Maryland. We see this articulated by scholars like Pamela Braboy Jackson at the Indiana University as well. And what this neglects, though, is that on average, our kids are more likely to flourish when they're raised by their own married parents. And for me, like, the most striking kind of illustration of this came when I looked at the kind of the plight of young men in contemporary America. And what I found in looking at young men today is that young men who are being raised outside of an intact married family are more likely to spend some time in prison or in jail by their late 20s than they are to graduate from college. And by contrast, young men from intact married families with their mom and dad at home are about 4 times more likely to graduate from college than they are to spend any time in prison or in jail. So it just kind of tells us that kind of the integrity of our families, the family structure that kids grow up in, matters a great deal for children. And I think, too, what the family diversity myth overlooks is that basically there's more love and more money typically in intact married homes. So generally speaking, intact married homes give their kids more attention, give their kids more affection, give their kids more consistent and constructive discipline than alternative families, because oftentimes those alternative families have more stresses that make parenting more challenging. And then financially, there's no question, again, that intact married families typically give their kids a lot more resources financially than kids who are being raised by single mothers or step families or some other kind of arrangement. So even when it comes to kind of looking at the importance of love and money for our children, we have to sort of appreciate that family structure matters for these 2 ingredients of family life for kids today.
Perfect. Professor, so as you mentioned, of course, that we know family parents thriving and raising great children, but you mentioned in your book as well that you realized in some very competitive environments, like very competitive fellowships or very competitive universities, you could realize more young people that has been raised in this kind of intact marriage, right?
Sorry, can you say the question again?
Yes, like when you speaks in the book that you realized, for example, when you analyzed people from the Thomas Jefferson Fellowship or students from Yale, they come more from this kind of intact marriages?
Yeah, so one of the striking things about kind of looking at American family life today and education as well is that we're seeing that basically the kids who are doing the best in our schools and colleges are markedly more likely to come from intact married households. And one of the things that I've seen is I've served as an advisor to the Jefferson Scholars Foundation here at the University of Virginia, which takes top students from around the world and gives them a free scholarship and stipend to come to the University of Virginia. And when I look at where these kids are living, what I find is that about 80% of these kids who are coming to compete for the Jefferson Scholarship, who've been nominated by their schools across the world, are coming from homes where both parents are on their application. And that just is telling me that they're disproportionately coming from, intact married families. And what we see in the research more generally is that young adults who are coming from intact families are about twice as likely to graduate from college and are much more likely to kind of be landing at elite universities than their peers from non-intact families. So about 75% of the college attendees at elite universities are from intact families. And that's striking because only about 1 in 2 young adults today are coming from intact families across the United States. So it's just kind of telling us that there's a benefit when it comes to thriving in school and college to having your own 2 parents in the household.
Perfect. There is a third myth, the soulmate myth, which contrasts with the family first model. Could you explain this for us?
So there's a really kind of compelling and popular book by Elizabeth Gilbert called Eat, Pray, Love. And in that book, she kind of recounts her kind of multiple relationships and how she kind of moves through one, marriage and one relationship after another. And in fact, she ends her book talking about how she finds this Brazilian guy who is a wonderful man in his 50s, a good dancer, a good cook, a real feminist. And, she seems to be kind of enamored with him. Of course, we learn 10 years later that she leaves him for another person. And so there's just kind of like this very romanticized view of love that she presents in her book on Eat, Pray, Love. And it's kind of what I call the sort of the soulmate myth, basically. This idea that love is about kind of an intense feeling or connection with someone. And it's about like having butterflies in your stomach when you're with someone. And this sort of like this assumption that everything is going to be like, always romantic, always intense, always emotional. And of course, if you've been married, a year or 2, you realize, no, marriage is hard, and it's not about just those romantic feelings, just that emotional connection, that romantic high. It's about, really about many, many things. It's about that romance, but it's about any kids you might have. It's about your finances, but above all, to sort of paraphrase St. Thomas Aquinas, it's about pursuing the good of the other. That's what true love is about. That's what love is in marriage and family. And the soulmate myth is confused. It thinks it's just about feeling good. And this is why people like Elizabeth Gilbert tend to cycle through different relationships and tend to abandon their husbands or their wives, when that romantic feeling is ebbing and flowing, across the course of their marriage, across the course of their relationship. And so again, I'm telling folks, look, there's something much more durable and important to look for in marriage. And that is kind of this more Thomistic view that love is a decision to will the good of the other. It's not a feeling that ebbs and flows. And the final point I make in the chapter is that I think, surprisingly, for devotees of the soulmate myth, what we see is that, generally speaking, people who embrace this more Thomistic view of love are not only more stably married, but they're more happily married because they have a more kind of durable and secure view of love than the folks who have this more romantic view of love. And that's how I end off that chapter on the soulmate myth.
Perfect. Although, Professor, the romance is important as well, because I remember that one of your chapters you mentioned that it's important for couples to have some time together, get out to take dinner together, this kind of stuff. I remember very well because I discussed this with my wife after reading your chapter. Could you mention these tips as well for maintain a bit of the romance?
Exactly. So what we see, in my book is there are kind of 5 pillars to strong and stable marriages. And one of those pillars is communion in marriage. And I talk about that partly in terms of thinking about cultivating a sense of emotional communion. So I'm not saying romance is not important, for instance. I'm just saying it's not the only thing in a marriage, right? And so when it comes, though, to kind of cultivating a sense of emotional communion in marriage, I do think that regular date nights where couples, are able to get out, maybe go to a restaurant, go to a movie, go dancing, something, that's sort of special and out of the ordinary is really helpful in fostering greater marital happiness. It looks also like greater marital stability as well. So this is one pillar to forging a strong and stable marriage, is sort of cultivating that sense of emotional connection in your marriage. And I think too, even, on a daily basis, trying to set aside some time where you're connecting. And in the words of one of my respondents, it's sort of phone down time. The phone is on the table and it's just eye to eye between husband and wife. And, there's an opportunity to connect. So the more that couples can do that, daily, but also kind of with a date night as well, I think the better.
Great. Okay, let's go to these 5 pillars. So of stable and happy unions in 21st century that you find through your analyzing your data. So you mentioned one of them as the team first mentality. Okay, yeah, I believe we just talked about it. And the second one is the child-centered marriage and what you call to avoid what you call the parent trap. Could you speak about it?
Yeah, so I think one of the obstacles facing young adults today to parenthood is kind of this sense that it's all about basically like crying toddlers or moody teenagers, and that parenthood is just one relentless slog through life, and it's a source of misery and difficulty. And, I acknowledge that, especially when the first child comes, married couples often see a dip in their marital happiness. So they're adjusting to the challenge of raising a baby, an infant, toddler. That's difficult. Lost sleep, new routines, new roles in the home. You got to talk a lot about how you're going to do this and negotiate a new paradigm in the marriage typically. That's all challenging, But what people don't recognize and don't realize, I think, about parenthood is that it's a source, again, of tremendous meaning and purpose and direction in life. And so we see that both women and men who are parents report more meaning in their lives. And then across the course of their life, now at least, what we're seeing in the United States, and I can't speak to Brazil, but I guess it's probably roughly the same story, is that today parents are happier than their childless, their peers. And they're also less lonely than their childless peers. We also see too, like in data on suicide, that people who are parents, especially women who are parents, are less likely to commit suicide. So I think we have to sort of realize that, yeah, a lot of this is true with life, right? There are a lot of things in life that are difficult and challenging and stressful. It's true for, like, if you play a sport and you're good at a sport. It's true if you're a musician, and you're performing for a concert. It's pretty stressful. It's true for most jobs. There's difficulty and stress. But, like if you're a good musician, a good athlete, a good worker, the benefits are real in terms of meaning and happiness, I think. And this is true also for being a parent. So yes, being a parent is difficult, but parents are more likely to be flourishing on a lot of different fronts. And that's one of the big points that I make in my chapter on parenthood or children in the book.
Perfect. Professor, it's a bit it's curious because at the same time that this kind of common narrative criticizes parenthood and say no, it's too stressful. It says that you should seek like professional outcomes or study outcomes that are also extremely stressful, can be extremely stressful and difficult. So they are not saying no, just rest. No, you need to make money, you need to have excellent job, but this kind of stuff can be stressful as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I do think that kind of the bar for what, is considered to be like the best way today to get married and have kids and live your life more generally has just, the bar has been rising and rising and rising because of, in part, kind of the power of social media. And people are kind of taking their cues from random, folks online, and they want to have the perfect wedding. They want to have the perfectly dressed children. They want to go on the best trips to Europe, and so all these things require like, thousands and thousands of dollars. And, what people lose, I think, in terms of their perspective here is you can get married and have kids and live a decent life in many places on a modest salary, but you have to sort of like recognize that you don't have to live a lifestyle like the one you might see on some Instagram platform. Basically, that's part of the challenge facing us, is that social media has given us unrealistic expectations about what a good life should look like.
Perfect. And I was wondering as well about this chapter because I have six kids and I brought all of them to the United States. And I was thinking, because in your book you says, no, having kids is very stressful at the beginning, but it's much more meaningful in the long term. And I'm feeling something like that during the trip. Sorry, because of course to take the flight with six kids is much more stressful, and to adjust all of them in the school in another language, another country is stressful. But it has been so much more meaningful that in comparison, if I just came when I was young and single, it would be easier. But it's much more meaningful because they are enjoying the trip as well. They are learning another language, have new experience. So it's truly more meaningful, have been for me.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what people discover, is that taking a hike with a bunch of kids, um, your own kids, visiting a new city with your own children, um, playing a sport with your kids, going to the neighborhood pool with your children, ends up being a lot more meaningful for us oftentimes than just doing these things on our own. And one of the things is, I have a large family as well, and I find myself in the neighborhood pool every summer, playing Marco Polo and things like that with my children. And I've been doing that since 2005, basically, with our children. And that's the beauty and power of having lots of kids, is that there's always some activity going on, and something fun to do. And this is something that I appreciate as a father. And I think people don't always, in the culture today, don't understand that children are not simply a burden, that they're also a blessing.
Perfect. Um, the next pillar, you mentioned that the question of you try to challenge the kind of mentality that you called the may be I do mentality. And in this chapter, you also mention. Let's start by explaining what's this maybe I do mentality, please.
So there are a lot of young adults today that I deal with, at the University of Virginia and just more generally, who are, they're understandably hesitant about committing themselves to marriage, and even committing themselves to kind of like a till death do us part, ethos when it comes to getting married. Even if they get married, they're thinking, well, I want to kind of make sure that I have an option if things don't work out. I might get divorced, and So there's just kind of like an unwillingness to fully commit themselves to marriage. And the challenge is they don't realize that the less committed they are, the more likely they are to end up getting divorced. And also the less likely they are to be flourishing in their marriages, to be happily married. And that's in part because there's always like a cloud of uncertainty hanging over their relationship and their marriage. And by contrast, if you have the sense that, no matter, we might have a fight, we might be upset with one another, there may be some problem in our marriage or our family or our life, but I can just count on my marriage and count on my wife, count on my husband to kind of be there come what may. That sense of security is enormously valuable and gratifying, both for life in general and for kind of one's marriage in particular. And so what I'm reporting in this chapter on commitment is that, couples who share a commitment to, being together until death do them part are more likely to be flourishing in their marriages. And that's an important point to underline in a world where people have a more oftentimes contingent, approach, a hesitant approach to entering into that lifelong commitment.
Perfect. You mentions as well during the book that despite the fact that marriage people tend to be happier, there are some exceptions, and you mention marriage with infidelity or toxic marriage. If you could talk a bit about this, and furthermore to say what are the groups that tend to cheat less.
So, I also talked to about the importance of fidelity in marriage, and just making the point that this is not rocket science, but infidelity is often, a source of deep marital distress and divorce, obviously. And so in terms of kind of like protecting your marriage, I talk about a guy who is profiled from my home state of Virginia, who's a successful professional and travels a lot for his work, and also, good looking, and plays in a band, once a month. And, he's the kind of guy who might be vulnerable to infidelity, just given his, given his job and given his situation. And yet when he travels, when he meets new people, he's very clear about kind of talking about his wife and children. He said to me, he's a family man, and he's careful too about when he's online, kind of, not, doing things that might put his marriage at risk. He said, for instance, he doesn't follow old girlfriends because there's a reason that they're in that position. And not surprisingly, his wife gives their marriage a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the best. So it's just kind of an example of the way in which, when you kind of like keep a certain degree of boundaries around your marriage, both in person, but now also online, I think you're more likely to, to protect the integrity of your marriage. And that's especially important when there's some kind of difficulty. I think when, there's a challenge in your marriage, there's a temptation to look for help or assistance or attention from, someone else. And if you've got a colleague at work, or, in the neighborhood, whatever else, who is, sympathetic and appealing and attractive, it's kind of at that point, when I think people are more likely to get into some kind of difficulty. And I talk about one story like that in the book. So the idea here is that, it's just important to have some degree of prudence in interacting with people, and, just to kind of make sure that your focus is on your spouse primarily, and that you're not kind of letting yourself get close to someone who would be, what's called an attractive alternative in the discipline or the research, to your husband or to your wife. This is kind of a dangerous path.
And did you find a difference among groups about who tend to cheat more or less?
Yeah, so what we see is that men are more likely to end up cheating. We see too that people who are less religious are more likely to cheat. Today, we see the people who are more liberal are more likely to cheat as well on some outcomes in addition. So, and so it's just kind of it's a reminder that kind of having certain customs and commitments, a certain degree of intentionality about fidelity is helpful. And, that's kind of the bottom line with this research.
Perfect. Just to clarify, liberal in Brazil has maybe a different meaning. In the United States, you use liberal as the contrary of conservative, right?
Correct. Yes. So culturally more progressive.
Perfect. Let's go to the fourth pillar. You speaks where you speaks about what you called neo-traditional model, and you try to explain on average and from what you could find in your data what women on average are looking for.
Yeah, so what I find is that it's kind of a combination of what could be called kind of like the new and the old. And so on the new front, I do find that women are more likely to be happily married when their husbands are emotionally attentive and engaged in their marriages, but also kind of really engaged with the kids, and that's kind of, especially on the kids front, that's often a newer pattern in contemporary life compared to like our grandparents' generation. So fathers who, play with their kids, help their kids with homework, are just doing a lot more with their children than was true for, previous generations. This makes their wives happier today, be they conservative or liberal, religious or secular. But I also find, too, that women are happier when they're judging their husbands to be good providers, when they describe their husbands as protective, when they view their husbands as strong. And so there's a way in which some kind of classically masculine attributes in terms of both protection and provision are still very much appealing to women, and in ways that run against a lot of the contemporary academic and media discourse about what makes women happy in their marriage. And I begin by just talking about some, articles and professors who are kind of saying that, like the 50-50 approach to marriage, or gender fluidity, or non-traditional guys are, the path to happiness in marriage. And I'm saying, look, folks, for the typical woman, and I profiled, for instance, a progressive, successful young lawyer in the South in the United States, and how she was recounting when she was working in Brooklyn, in New York City, she found the guys who were strong, out and about, to be more attractive. And that when she was asked about her kind of, hopes for a husband, her number one, criterion that she mentioned was ambition. So it just kind of was the case that even among more progressive women, what you see is there's a way in which they're looking for men who have these traits, that they're professionally successful in their own domain, and they're more likely to be, physically strong and protective in how they treat their girlfriend or their wife.
Perfect. And Professor, do you believe that is there here any kind of division between the discourse and what the facts and the actions reveal?
So yeah, I do think that there's a tension here in terms of what we kind of hear from the culture that kind of discounts the importance, I think, particularly of classic masculine norms and behaviors, and what is really linked to women's happiness in their relationships. And kind of besides the empirical facts that I present in the book, I also can point to, obviously, if you kind of look at like a romance novel, it just gives you a sense about the way in which a lot of classically masculine attributes are appealing and attractive to women. And we don't talk about this often honestly in today's culture. And again, we have to sort of, I think, also pair that with this idea that I call kind of paying attention for men. So it's, basically to provide, to protect, and to pay attention is what I talk about in the book. And so when men are in the home, it's about, in part, paying attention to your wife practically and emotionally. It's about paying attention to your kids practically and emotionally. And a lot of these kind of newer family patterns are examples of this practice of paying attention to your wife and kids. And those are important as well.
Perfect. Professor, actually, I'm wondering here now. I believe you. I can't remember. I believe you didn't mention this in the book. But do you know any data now that you spoke about pay attention? Do you know any data about how many hours people are in cell phones and levels of happiness? Because the cell phone is today, they they think that it's stealing our time and our attention when we are at home, right?
Correct. And so my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang and Michael Toscano, have done some research just indicating that for contemporary couples who spend a lot of time on the phone, they're less likely to be happily married. And we have seen, one obvious expression of this, I think, practically, is that we're seeing, even in marriages, sexual frequency is down. And I think what often happens is people are, end up, on the couch or in the bed, and they're scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or, Facebook, whatever, or Netflix or some other platform. And, that inhibits talking, it inhibits, romance, it inhibits physical intimacy even too. So, that's generally speaking not a good thing. So yeah, we have to keep working on, like, one habit, we try to do in my family is just when people come in, just to put, there's like a power, kind of corner in the kitchen. So just to leave your phone in the kitchen, getting charged up, and just kind of try to leave it there as much as possible. So I think the more that families can have like a practice of just kind of leaving their phones in one place, not on their personage, that's better.
Perfect. So, could you speak about the role of religion on marriage?
So one thing that I found in looking at kind of mainline or mainstream media discourse about, religion and family, was there were a lot of stories that were kind of suggesting that there was a negative link between faith and family. And there was a big interview in the New Yorker, for instance, that was arguing that Christian men, evangelical Protestant men, were kind of like hung up about pornography, and they had like this sort of, antiquated view that sex was sacred. And so they were guilty if they, looked at pornography or, images of women online, things like that. And that their wives were, more likely to sort of hector them and divorce them if they were struggling with pornography. And so this article kind of gave you the sense that faith was an obstacle to flourishing families today. And it's certainly true that for religious men and religious couples, something like pornography is a bigger issue than it would be for secular couples today. But what this New Yorker article completely overlooked was that in general, religious men and religious couples are more happily married, including evangelical Protestants. They're more stably married, and they even have more sex and more sexual satisfaction than their secular peers today. Because on average, having a faith, being connected to a church community, tends to give people access to support, to a good example, and accountability. Helps men, for instance, stay off pornography if they're like, going to confession, if they're Catholic, or if they're going to a small group, if they're evangelical Protestant guys. So there was kind of no recognition that, the bigger picture here that was being kind of excluded from the New Yorker story was that, generally speaking, religious couples are more likely to be happily married and stably married.
And is there data saying the same about more conservative couples?
So conservative couples, yeah. So conservatives are more likely today to be married and to be happily married than liberal, but especially actually moderate couples. And so I think part of the story here is that people who have a clear view of a clear sense of how to do marriage and family, actually both on the clear left from early work that I did, but also on the right, um, tend to be happier in their marriages. But conservatives are the happiest, and that's because in part I think they tend to embrace the idea and the institution of marriage. They tend to understand and appreciate that kids are more likely to thrive with two parents. And they also understand that women and men are different. And they don't expect everything to be the same when it comes to how they, divide up the labor of the family. So these are some of the reasons I think that conservatives tend to be happier in their marriages than other people.
Okay, and speaking about this division between discourse and facts, uh, like it surprised me as well. In the book, you mentioned that elite groups in the United States, although they support this kind of discourse that marriage is irrelevant or even bad, they tend to have, like for example, college people that get formed on college, they tend to have to be married and to have more stable marriages. uh, why do you think that there is this kind of disconnection between their discourse and their attitudes?
So yeah, I talk in the book about how many more liberal elites, progressive elites, talk left, walk right. And so the idea here is that they recognize that in today's elite discourse, you should signal your allegiance to progressive ideas about family. All family forms are wonderful. Single mothers are heroic, all these things. And I'm not saying that there isn't truth to some of these ideas, right? But there's no public acknowledgement that what's happening privately for most progressive elites is that they're married, they're stable, they're invested in their children, and they're living in networks where everyone's doing that same thing as well. This came through. I was talking to an elite journalist in Washington, D.C., and he was, saying that he was going to an event at a progressive private school in Washington, D.C. And there were like, I don't know, he wanted to say like 250 kids at some big school event. He said there were 500 parents there. And his point was that, this school has like a commitment to all sorts of progressive ideas, including family diversity. But when you look at what people are actually doing on the ground in this elite, expensive, progressive school, is almost all the parents there are married. And almost all the families kind of benefit from marriage as the foundation to the family. And so this is the challenge, is that our elites often will not publicly talk about the value of marriage for them and their children. And they won't talk about their experience, navigating difficulties and challenges to, their students, to their readers, if they're journalists, to their workers, if they're CEOs, right? And so this weird reality exists where people are privately benefiting at the upper reaches of our society from marriage and stable families and doing nothing publicly to reinforce this.
Perfect. So, our last question. Let's now speak a bit about public policy. Uh, and this is something that concerns me. I spoke with some representatives here in Brazil, people with in good faith, acting in good faith, goodwill, want to do good things, but they almost all of them told me we just do not know what to do. We want to help, we want to make families more strong, but we um, don't know exactly what to do. In your book, you try to outline some recommendations about public policy, especially you you sketch it in 5 points. Could you speak a bit for us?
So in terms of public policy, I think one of the key ideas here is to do no harm to marriage. And we do have policies in the United States, for instance, that unintentionally penalize marriage. So just the way that we do our means-tested welfare policies regarding healthcare and food assistance are set up so that basically, if you're a single mother or you're a cohabiting mother, you get more benefits from the government. If you get married and report your income as a couple, you can lose access to things like free healthcare and food assistance in the United States. So we have to get rid of those, what are called marriage penalties. Again, public policies that unintentionally penalize marriage, they're found in many different countries across the globe. That's one idea. A second idea is to kind of recognize and realize that culture matters. And so when it comes to what people are taught in schools and through public campaigns, now on social media as well, we should tell our kids and young adults the truth. And the truth is that marriage is, better for most people, most children, financially, socially, and emotionally, as we've discussed today. And, they're not being told that truth in many contexts. And so I think the government could go ahead and tell them that truth as well. And then the third thing that I would say is we need to be thinking about new ways to address the issue of the cost of living for families. Recognize they make lots of sacrifices to raise their kids. So on the one hand, we should have generous child tax credits or allowances for families with kids to kind of help them financially as they're raising their kids, but also be more attentive to the challenge of finding housing for families. And this can mean, in particular, thinking about kind of, at least in the United States context, maybe as Brazil as well, but minimizing regulations that make it difficult to build housing that's affordable for families who are, getting started with young children, especially. So just doing more to make sure that there's a stock of affordable apartments, condominiums, and especially single family homes that make it easier for people to start a family and have children, and to be able to put a roof over their family's head. So those are three things that I think are worth thinking about, among other ideas.
Perfect. Professor, so it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. Your book is extremely illuminating and it helped me a lot. So if you want to say anything to finish our conversation and send a last message for our audience.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on today, Andreas. And I think the thing that I would want to stress is that, in today's culture, there's often this idea that, freedom is, the way, freedom from encumbrances of one sort or another. And what I want to suggest just as a closing message is that actually family is the way, not freedom, really. And that people who have families, again, are more likely to be living lives that, yes, can be challenging and difficult in certain ways, but are less lonely, more meaningful, and happier because we're meant, I would say most of us are meant for family. And one core foundation for a strong family is a good marriage. And that's kind of a key message that my book offers to the world today.
So, Professor, thanks very much for joining us. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.